We're in Revelation chapter 7, and we're discussing the 12 tribes here that are listed in Revelation chapter 7. We've noted that the tribe of Dan is missing, and yet there's still 12 tribes, and why is that? And Joseph got the birthright. And he had 2 sons. That's why, if you look at verse 8, from the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000, from the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. But if you look at verse 6, from the tribe of Asher, 12,000, from the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000, from the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. So here you have Manasseh was one of Joseph's sons, so Joseph is listed as Joseph, and he's listed as Manasseh. So there are your 12 tribes right there. And also verse 7 says, from the tribe of Simeon, from the tribe of Levi. Levi is the tribe in the Old Testament that did not get a land area. Now, I will also say, by the way, if for scriptural documentation on this birthright, in Deuteronomy chapter 21:17, if you want to look it up and study it, you can stop the tape or write it down for later reference. But in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17, is where the Mosaic law talks about the birthright and the eldest son getting twice as much as any of the other sons. And that was the law of the birthright. So, this is the 144,000 that are sealed out of Israel. Now remember, the 144,000, there will be Israelites. Remember Matthew chapter 25. There will be Israelites and there will be Gentiles that will both make it through the tribulation period. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. And in Matthew chapter 24, we read in verse 22, if those days had not been shortened or cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. So there are going to be people that will make it all the way through the tribulation. Some of these will be God's sheep, and others will be God's goats, or goats, if you will. I guess they aren't God's goats, but goats. Because in verse 31 of Matthew 25, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, in verse 32, all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. So there are going to be people, Jews and Gentiles, both Jews that believe and Jews, I guess, that don't, and Gentiles that believe, and certainly Gentiles that don't, that will make it all the way through the tribulation. And they will be gathered, and Christ will judge them after the tribulation and whether or not they will get to enter into his kingdom. So verse 9, then, of Revelation chapter 7, we've just seen Jews that are sealed. We've just seen Jews that are sealed. Now, starting in verse 9, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in the front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. All the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures. They fell down on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen. What a great praise verse, huh? Boy, what great praise that is. Then one of the elders asked me, these in white robes, who are they and where did they come from? I answered, Sir, you know. That's a great answer. You know. And he said, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, notice here, remember I talked about chronological order? Notice here that it's written like these guys have already made it. Now, we haven't, as far as the book of Revelation itself goes chronologically, We're not even halfway through yet, and we've still got an awful lot of tribulation to go, but God is speaking of these men as if they've already made it all the way through. So again, it's just a chronological note to pay attention to. By the way, another thing I'd like to point out, notice here how in Revelation the Jews and the Gentiles are separate. Again, this is very indicative of the Old Testament nature of the book of Revelation. You don't see this in the Christian church. You don't read the church epistles where Paul writes to the Corinthians and says, now let me see, how many Jews and how many Gentiles do you have in your church? This separation of Jew and Gentile in the church epistles just does not exist, but it was extremely clear in the Old Testament. Even when there were Gentiles that lived amongst Israel, they were always known as Gentiles amongst Israel. They were never counted with the tribes. And that's exactly what we see here in the book of Revelation. It's very, very difficult for me to think that people can read the Old Testament and read the epistles and really understand the flow of the way those books were written and then not see the extreme differences between this writing here and what we see in the 7 church epistles and the incredible similarity between this writing here in the Old Testament, because this is exactly, this crisp separation between the Jew and the Gentile is exactly what we would expect of the Old Testament, and nothing like what we read in the epistles. Again, there's a whole lot more evidence for just understanding that Christians are not going to be in this time period. These are believers, yes, but they aren't Christians. The church of the body was raptured out before this all started.